adventures of Batman with Robin, Boy Wonder. Batman and Robin, dynamic duo against crime and corruption, whose real identities as millionaire philanthropist Bruce Wayne and his young ward Dick Grayson are known only to Alfred, the faithful butler. Ever alert, they respond swiftly to a signal from the police, and moments later, from the secret Batcave deep beneath Wayne Manor, they roar out to protect life, limb, and property as Batman and Robin, Cape Crime Fighters. Batman and Robin, scourge of Gotham City's kooky criminals. The Joker, clown prince of crime. The Penguin, pudgy purveyor of perfidy. And the cool, cruel Mr. Freeze. Watch out, villains. Here come Batman and Robin.
Welcome back, citizens, to an all-new episode of the Batcave Podcast. It's your old bat chum, John S. Drew here. And as we promised at the end of our last look at the Filmation 1968 series, we're going to take a little bit of an overview, sort of a look back at everything that we found wonderful and not so wonderful about Filmation's attempt at Batman back in 1968 for one season. And joining me as he did for the entire review of the series is the man himself from 13thdimension.com, Mr. Dan Greenfield. Hey, Dan.
Hey, John, how are you?
I'm good. Now, I say the good and the bad because we were honest about how we felt about things that worked, things that didn't work. And when I came to you and said, let's do this, one of the things I also said was, hey, let's look at this show in terms of how it was influenced by 66 Batman, because it literally was on the heels of the 66 series being canceled, 68 that fall. There was Filmation ready to go with the animated series, which was also kind of interesting that they managed to get it on air so quickly.
Yeah, well, it kind of shows. But yeah, I mean, once they got word that they could do it, because the live action show was being canceled, they rushed it into production, and they wanted to be all set to go. They had wanted to do Batman. But now this was, their chance. So it really, as an overall theme, it definitely feels like a de facto fourth season of the show. Campier in some respects than the show itself. In other respects, not as campy, a little bit more straightforward, which is something I always appreciated about the Filmation series, because it really does kind of capture that bridge between the campy parts of the 60s and the more sober comics that were coming in the later 60s and early 70s. So what's wonderful about watching this show is seeing when they landed, and when they would land, it was great, and seeing when they didn't, and it was either wonderfully humorous mistakes or just, plain old stinkers. But there really weren't that many stinkers in this series, maybe moments. But on the whole, I think there's something good about just about every episode that they produced.
No, I agree. It's funny, too, because we did note this early on as the series was moving through, that those early episodes are serviceable, but they weren't always as memorable. And it wasn't until we got to midway and, of course, the end that we could see that Filmation was hitting its stride. So you can see that, here's the rushed result. Here's once we got moving and we knew what we were doing, and basically making this look like our own show, not just, hey, I mean, like you say, I agree. I look at this as a de facto fourth season, but it's also Filmation's own show, especially when they started doing things like Simon the Pieman and The Judge.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've kind of struggled with throughout this entire run that we've been doing this, what did we start, about 2 years ago? I mean, it's been a while. About 2 years since it took us to actually watch all of these episodes. And one of the things that we were dealing with and have been dealing with all the way through is making sure that we had a rough estimate of when these individual episodes aired. Because you've got Wikipedia's got a listing, and there are listings out there, and we think we watched them in the proper order, but they're packaged differently depending on how you get the episodes themselves. So based on what we've been able to put together, the overarching feeling is almost like a three-part series. You had the beginning, where kind of ups and downs, shakeout crews didn't feel like they necessarily had a good feel for what they were doing. And by the middle season, they were really kind of getting it, but the series was a little formulaic. You had more team-ups. They seemed to be kind of repeating themselves a little bit. But then the last third, as we went down the stretch, there's a lot more confidence in the storytelling. They're adding characters of their own. Like you mentioned, Simon the Pie Man, the Judge, the horrendous Doll Man. Was at least an attempt to do something that was their own thing.
Right.
And the episodes themselves, featuring the more established villains, were improved. They were sharper. They were more interesting. They were funnier. And it really did seem like by the end, I was left wanting more. And part of the reason I wanted to do this kind of valedictory, episode, looking at the series as a whole, is I wasn't quite ready to let it go. It was I had a great time doing this. I really did. I really enjoyed it more than I even thought that I was going to. I knew that I would, to the point where, and I can't remember if we've mentioned this at all, but you had mentioned to me if I wanted to continue on with Filmation 77, and I was like, nah, I can't stand the Batmite thing. I can't abide it. So I didn't want to do it. But then about halfway through doing this, I'm like, I want to do 77. I want to do 77 because I want to keep going. But unfortunately, well, good for you. But unfortunately for me, you've got another guest host who will be doing that, which fair enough. All's fair in Batman and Filmation. But yeah, I was left wanting more. I wanted to see more episodes. I wanted to see where they were going to go next. But unfortunately, we only got what we got.
Well, maybe along the line you can join us for an episode or two of the 77 series.
Come over for Thanksgiving. No,
there you go.
Maybe I will, but that wasn't my point there. My point was just
I know.
And I was really enjoying what we were doing, and I really enjoyed watching these episodes because, when I grew up watching, and I know I've mentioned this before, but in case someone is just jumping in at this point, the way I discovered these cartoons, I was very young. I was probably 5 years old. I think I was in kindergarten, and it was in syndication on Channel 5 in New York, and I used to watch. I was an AM kid in kindergarten because we had split-day kindergarten where I grew up. And after school, my mom was working, my dad was working, and we had a babysitter pick me up, bring me to her house while we waited for her kids to come home and my sister to come home, my older sister. And this was on, like in that kind of that time that in between me coming home and them coming home, or somewhere right around there. And I just used to love these cartoons. I loved the TV show, but this and Migos and the Batman TV show and the 66 show and some of those early comics that were coming out, early to me anyway, early 70s, late 60s comics. This was my formative Batman years. So I have a great nostalgic feeling for these cartoons. But that said, I didn't remember, other than a couple of them, in individual episodes. And some of the more memorable episodes were simply because they came up again in the 80s and you'd see them on TV or you'd see them in, on VHS as part of the Superpowers collection. So there were some that I did remember because of repeated viewings as I got older. But the vast majority of these I didn't remember watching as individual episodes, just like I remembered the feeling of watching these shows. And they hold up in that way. They really, when you do get to watch them again, they're as entertaining as like Batman the Animated Series, but in a much different way, in a much, kind of softer, gentler, childlike way, as opposed to the more adult Batman the Animated Series, which is great for a completely different reason.
Now, I was in the same boat, 5 years old or so, Channel 5, watching the show in the afternoon. I was an AM kindergarten kid too, along with Superman and Aquaman and all the other DC hero shows they did. I'm curious about one thing though. Did you ever get to watch USA's rebroadcast of them with their repackaged openings?
Yeah. Yeah, they had my recollection is this is how it was framed in my mind. Is that they just used to call the show Superheroes when it was on Channel 5. That's what I remember being listed as in TV Guide. And I don't remember an opening credits. I just remember the show starting.
Right.
Just like Aquaman. I'm having a hard time remembering exactly how it played out, but I think that it was just Aquaman and Batman that they used to show on when I was watching it when I was a kid, like when I was around 5. And it was like, it would be like Batman, part one of something, and then an Aquaman in the middle, and then a Batman at the end, or something like that.
Right.
And it would go on for a half hour, or whatever it was. But I don't remember seeing the other ones until later, when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old when it was in syndication again, because it wasn't a constant. It would come and go on the schedule. And that's when I started to see the Superman and the Superboy, and occasionally, again, maybe see those the other guests, the superheroes as they're called, I guess. Green Lantern and the Atom and the Flash. But it had been so long before when I'd seen those as a kid and got to see them again as an adult that I almost wondered if I had imagined them. It was like one of those things that you remember seeing, but in the days before you couldn't track everything down online, it was almost like I remember seeing that Flash thing, but I really couldn't put my finger on it. And anyway. And then yes, of course, much later when USA Network had them, they had those goofy openings, which I think were just simply repurposed for Boomerang, because Boomerang brought them back maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and you'd see a lot of them too. But none of it was ever like complete until they were released on, for disc and download and now streaming. Now you can actually see the entire series, and that's what we were able to do, and really kind of look at these things and dive in.
Right.
Speaking of diving in, your comment online recently about how Aquaman is actually your favorite Filmation cartoon. We have to do a special episode on that because I love the Aquaman cartoons. But we'll talk about that offline because I've got some thoughts about that. Anyway.
I just felt that Aquaman was, in terms of, first of all, I think he still has the coolest theme song out of all of them, with maybe Green Lantern coming second. Yeah. And
Aquaman's great. Yeah.
And I know it's going to sound weird because it didn't look at all really like he was underwater. They didn't even make an effort to sort of haze the water a little bit or anything like they maybe did in later cartoons. But I thought his animation was the most fluid.
Oh, yeah. Well, but they did, though. They did have those effects that made it seem, I mean, it wasn't hazy, but it did have those effects like that. Lou Scheimer, I know we're kind of getting off point, and we should save this for an Aquaman special. Lou Scheimer, in his autobiography, does talk about what they did to make the watery effects. And so it did have that kind of, I don't know, well, it's a watery effect. It may not be hazy, but it does definitely feel like they're underwater, which is what I love about the show. It also has beautiful backgrounds.
Yes.
And it is the best looking of all of the Filmation shows. But I digress.
Well, the reason I asked you about the USA one was because I remember when they did the repackaging, it also came with new titles and updated version of the theme song for the Batman theme. And one of the things you point out in your 13 Great Things About Filmation's Batman over at 13th Dimension is the theme song, which I'm in a love-hate relationship with.
Why is that?
There are times where it's like just the whole... I don't know, that annoys me, but then there are other times when the whole that kicks in. I like the theme better when it's actually used as like background music during the cartoon rather than as a main theme. It doesn't come across as a main theme to me.
Oh, I love it. I think it does. I think it's really great. You've got the strobing blue and red colors. I mean, if you're given a seizures, you probably shouldn't watch the opening credits. but not to make light, but it's true. But also, I do like it. I do like the pop of it. Of course, they're trying for that kind of bombastic,
right?
Batman '66 opening credits kind of thing. Obviously, they were trying to do something of their own, so it's loud, it's brassy. No, I really like it a lot, and I also like it at the end too, when they, when it's sort of the reprise at the end where they jump into the Batmobile and head down what I like to think of as the never-ending Fifth Avenue on the Upper East Side of Gotham. Because you see, they keep passing the Guggenheim over and over and over again.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, but I love the theme. I think it's great, and the incidental music throughout actually all of the shows is fun.
Right.
Batman '66 in particular, I do like.
Yeah. But I did like the theme updated for the 80s, 90s, whatever it was. 90s, I guess, when USA was running them there, even though the titles themselves weren't that inspired, but at least the music was cool. It was just like sliding, like cartoon panels, comic panels, like it was trying to look almost like a comic book with scenes.
I just don't remember the music. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well.
Batman, the Caped Crusader, and Robin, the Boy Wonder. Millionaire Bruce Wayne and his young ward Dick Grayson are secretly the dynamic duo, protecting Gotham City from its most fiendish villains. Here comes Batman and Robin.
Now, something else, too, since I'm bringing up the 13 great things about Filmation's Batman over at 13thdimension.com, which I'll put a link for in the show notes so you can take a look, too. You point out, and we've brought this up from time to time on the show, but I really wanted to take a moment because, in particular, I love the example you give here, the artistry.
Yeah.
You know, the artwork, the matte paintings, and you give this picture here from Heritage Auctions. I'm guessing this is some of the cell work of the vehicles. Oh God, I want that.
Yeah, me too. It's great. I did a couple of different. I'm glad and thank you for mentioning it. 13th Dimension. I've written a lot about Filmation and Filmation Batman over the years. There are two basic stories that are worth a look here, and I'm going to be I'll be representing these in conjunction with this podcast. But I did something called 13 Quick Thoughts, the kitschy kick of Filmation Batman, which is something that I had written first. That was earlier. I'd done that, back in like 2017 and talked about some just like kind of off the cuff things. And then the 13 Great Things About Filmation's cartoon was done more after we started doing the podcast, for the 50th anniversary of the show, which kind of sharpened some specific points. So they're both worth a read. But in what you're talking about here, there was this. I found this cell this collection of cells that Heritage Auctions was putting up, and it's got the Batmobile, the Batplane, the Batboat, and the Batcycle, and it's just a look at those designs. And I really like the way that they designed, as we've talked about a number of times, the vehicles on the show, because they weren't beholden to. First off, they wanted it to look kind of like the '66 show, but they weren't going to do or couldn't do the exact same designs. So they did kind of a spin on the designs. But then you got to see things that they never showed on the live action show, things that they could do, again, in cartoon form, because budget issues, they would allow for it. So you do get to see a really, really cool looking Batplane, which you never saw in the '66 show. The Batmobile itself is sort of a hybrid between the comic book, what they were doing in the comics at the time, plus the '66 Batmobile. But it's a great version of the Batmobile that they did, the sleek black, 1960s, convertible, but with the big blue bat on the hood, and I think the Batcycle is kind of the weakest of them, but the Batboat looks really cool. The Batboat probably is it's, other than the coloring, it's very similar to what you saw on the '66 show. But they used the black and orange a lot for their vehicles, except for the Batmobile itself, which was again blue and black. But I love the design work that they did on some of the things on the show. And like you said, the matte paintings. I mean, some of those matte paintings were just beautiful. I think of the final episode, or the final two-part episode, where they had like the billboard with Batman and Batgirl on the we've mentioned that. And that's just a great design, a great illustration. And it always reminds you, these things were looked at as kind of schlocky and limited animation, and it was done on the cheap. But that's because it was done on the cheap. It was a budget issue. But there's talent there. I mean, these people all knew what they were doing. This was a studio of professionals. It just happened to be that the way animation was at the time, television animation, it was all done on the cheap. Hanna-Barbera was doing it on the cheap. Filmation was doing it on the cheap. It wasn't like it was back in the 40s with the Fleischers and what Warner Brothers was doing, and certainly not what Disney was doing. So when you take it on its own terms, you know that it's going to be kind of cheesy, but it is still great to look at.
Well, that's something, too, I don't think we're very fair with when it comes to cartoons like this and other series as well, is that there is a difference between the artistry and the animation. Yes, animation is an art unto itself, but the actual drawings that are done, and there's some really beautiful stuff. You bring up the last episode. I'm remembering there's certain moments with the Riddler that they drew him in particular very menacingly, and just the shading and such was beautiful. Yeah, the animation behind it is kind of stiff, but if you stop, and that's why when you look at that still that you put up there on the page, it's like, wow, those were beautiful vehicles.
Yeah, and also that extends to the character designs themselves. I mean,
yes.
Everybody. One of the things that I do at 13th Dimension every year is when it's Alex Toth's birthday, I basically hunt the web and find some of his old model sheets that he did for Super Friends and some of the other Hanna-Barbera shows that he did. And I like to, trot out 13 of them every year. And they're extremely popular. People just eat it up. And I look at Filmation's designs, and frankly, I don't know who did the character design work for Filmation, particularly these shows. But the thing that I love about them is that whether we are talking about Batman or Aquaman or Superman, and even the other superheroes as well, they did a great job of capturing the house look of the comic book in animated form. The Batman and Robin look like, for the most part, the way Batman and Robin were being drawn in the comics at the time. It's got that Carmine Infantino house style. And that extends to the villains. That Joker that they draw, that's Carmine Infantino's Joker. That's Carmine Infantino's Riddler. That's Carmine Infantino's Penguin. Catwoman, of course, deviated because Catwoman was, she didn't deviate from the comic book. She deviated from the TV show. It's just that Catwoman didn't have really kind of a set look. We saw her two different ways on this show. We saw her in a painting that the Riddler had supposedly drawn where she's dressed completely differently. But for the most part, of course, she's in the green and white outfit, which was being introduced in the comics at that time to look like Julie Newmar and not look like Julie Newmar at the same time.
Right.
So it's kind of that, but it does look like the way she was being drawn in the comic books also. But you see the way that they did it, and it's the line work. It looks like Carmine Infantino. And if you look at the Aquaman cartoons, it looks like Nick Cardy. If you look like the Superman cartoons, it looks like Kurt Swan.
Sure, yeah.
So, but it all looks like Filmation too. It's wonderful how they were able to do that.
Now, I did a little looking around. It's interesting to note that most websites that mention this series pretty much bring up the same topics or the same points of interest in terms of how the show was packaged. For the first season, where it was paired with the Superman show as the Superman Batman Hour, and then became Batman with Robin the Boy Wonder the following season on its own. But I did like this one here. I found tvtropes.org gets into the types of tropes that you could see in this show, including the Commissioner Gordon, who is the trope namer. He's a bit younger than usual with red hair to match his daughter Barbara, and he has no mustache. The use of epileptic flashing lights, which you point out. Harmless freezing,
Yes.
as we see throughout Batman and Robin getting frozen by Mr. Freeze.
Hold on with that point for a second.
Sure.
That's one of my favorite things because one of the things that we've talked about is that watching some of these episodes are almost like the way you would play Batman and Robin in the backyard. There was a childlike quality to some of the storytelling that really didn't make sense. It did not hold up under scrutiny. Let's put it that way. But it didn't matter because it was fun. It was so much fun to watch. But they felt like this is how when you would play with your friends, these were the kind of storylines you'd almost come up with. And the idea of being frozen, it's like playing red light, green light. So one of the favorite things to play as a kid was playing Batman and Mr. Freeze, whether you were playing with your Migos, you didn't have Mr. Freeze, but you'd improvise, or I would. And I know other kids did too. But the idea of not being quote-unquote killed, but being frozen in place and you couldn't move. I mean, that kids love doing stuff like that. You got to stand right there, you can't move, and then somehow you get defrosted and you can move again. There's something wonderfully fun about that. But yeah, it's a trope because it's an easy one,
right.
And it's fun.
Two others here that I found funny. Laughing Mad. They point out just the Joker and the Penguin, but I think about it, Riddler certainly has his share of mad laughter, and Catwoman has her cackle.
Oh yeah, horrible too. But yeah, the Riddler. Well, as we've said with the Riddler, it's basically Ted Knight doing Frank Gorshin.
Right.
He tries to speak with that kind of staccato. It ends up being its own thing, but it is him trying to do his version of the Frank Gorshin Riddler.
That wrecking ball is coming closer and closer.
In another few moments, the ball will reach their floor, and down they will go.
Look, Robin, that jagged piece of pipe.
I see it. The next shot should do it.
And of course, he's got the, that kind of laugh. He does
pretty good.
Each one of them a distinct laugh. You've got the Joker's, which is more like a cackle. The Penguin, which is kind of a whoo. Instead of giving him the Burgess Meredith quack, he gives him that kind of like that weird kind of almost bird-like, which is fitting. The bird-like sound that he gives, and then Catwoman sometimes meows and sometimes kind of just screeches, and yet she's got that laugh. But but yeah, it's they all do have that. Plus, don't forget, you've got Batman and Robin's laugh and Gordon's laugh too when they do the bat taunt at the end of every episode.
Right.
You know, especially whenever Olan Soule laughs as Batman, it always comes off as really forced. You know, it never sounds quite sincere, but that's okay. It usually comes across when Batman is torturing some villain who's behind bars, telling them "I told you so," which is always kind of funny too.
Right. And that leads to the other trope that the puns.
Oh yeah,
tons of puns.
That was a huge part of Batman, not just in the TV show with Robin and whatever, but the comics themselves were filled with them. Batman and Robin were, and I've written some about this, and I'll be writing a little bit more. Is one of the things about going back and rereading the comic books from the '60s specifically, and I've been for a couple of years now. I've been rereading Batman and Detective in order from 1964 forward, basically the start of the new look in 1964. And as we're talking right now, I am now in the summer of 1967. And I started this a couple of years ago. It just shows to show you how long it's taking me to do it, because I wish I just had like a block of time where I could really kind of get through a couple of years worth of comics. So it's kind of a slow roll. But you do see also not just the 66 show, you see stuff from the comic books being translated onto the screen as well. And that's one of them, the quips and the puns during the fight. And even before the camp era in the Batman comics, which actually was not all that long, and I'll be writing some more about that at 13th Dimension also, the way the TV show's influence on the comic was gradual, and then it hit a peak, and then it ended actually before the show was actually canceled. There was some holdover there, but there was actually a lot of kind of push and pull within DC Comics itself about how much they wanted the TV show to influence the comics. There was some resistance there. They understood that it was popular. They understood that they wanted to sell comics, and it was selling comics. But they didn't really love the tone of the show, in the comics themselves. And there were tons of letters about it, and about we don't want it to be like the TV show, and some saying I do like it, all that. I'm kind of getting off point, but the point I'm making is that what Filmation did is that it really did take the elements of the live-action show and the comics and put it together as part of Filmation. So you do kind of get that crossover, which I really, really love, because it does, as many times as I'll see things that reference or seem to be influenced from the TV show, I'll see references or at least concepts that show up from the comic book, which I really, really enjoy. Not only just the way it looks, but also the tone of some of those stories, which are somewhat, quote, more serious than the 66 TV show, but also still that Silver Age kind of goofy, wacky, juvenile approach to comics that was still going on in DC in the Silver Age. Not still going on, that kind of emblemized the DC in the Silver Age.
Right. Now, I know we talked a little about the show overall as well in our last episode. I was asking about best villains and things like that. Yeah. And I'm curious, for you, what episode stood out the most?
Well, if I go down a list, right. The ones that kind of jump out, How Many Herring in a Wheelbarrow is definitely one of my favorites, because if for no other reason that it has, I think, ultimately one of the two best death traps on the in the series. You had them sliding down into that area, that chute that sends them down into a furnace that's got the Joker's face on it. It's one of the coolest looking. It's probably the best sequence. I think I've actually written that it is the best sequence in the entire series. It's really exciting. It's colorful. It's dangerous, and I really love that part of the episode. And that kind of elevates the whole episode for me. The Partners in Peril that we've talked about is one of the great episodes. This is all four great villains team up together, Penguin, Joker, Riddler, Catwoman. And Catwoman basically schools these guys. She's the smartest one there, and she really kind of runs things, which I really liked. I thought that was great. His Honor the Joker, when the Joker runs for mayor, and that one is one of the things that we talked about with that episode is that not only it was prescient with, in terms of its politics, but it was written at a time when, of course, there was a lot of political uproar in the 1968. And the show itself was not written like Batman the Animated Series, as we've pointed out. It wasn't written for all ages. it was written for children.
Right.
So anytime you get the sense that they were having adult references, like there's that one episode where Commissioner Gordon laments the possibility of losing his pension, which cracks me up, the way, the context of it and the way he says it. These guys, who are writing this, and it was mostly men, I think in terms of writing, it was all men, and there were women who were involved in the production side of things. But any of that kind of humor, they had to have been doing for themselves, because they weren't writing. They were writing down to children, which is actually some of the worst parts of the show, is that they were writing down as opposed to writing across, which is what they did with the Batman the Animated Series of Bruce Timm and Paul Dini and those guys. They wrote it so that adults could enjoy that stuff. This was written for kids. So anytime they would get into some of the more adult humor, you knew that it was all supposed to be sly and it was self-referential. His Honor the Joker is probably the best example of adult humor being injected into the show, and it being, I'm sure, over the heads of every kid who watched it at the time. Right. But that's a really good episode. Simon the Pie Man, the original, the first appearance, both of them are really, really good. But that's a great one. One of my all-time favorites is from Catwoman with Love. Yeah. I think it's a great episode. Jigsaw Jeopardy, as I've mentioned, is a great episode. Just because it's so off its hinges, it's probably, of all of them, makes no sense whatsoever, but you roll with it. It takes two to make a team. I'm mentioning mostly two-parters. Right. But these are the ones that really kind of jump out at me the most. But those are the ones that because I'm just going down the list of all the episodes that we've done for our and one of the things, I know you have it at your website, I also have it at 13th Dimension, something called the Filmation Batman Index, which links to all of our episodes in order, plus also has all of the links of all the other Filmation Batman stories that I've written. So it's a good resource for anybody who might want to, anybody who's listening and wants to explore some more. But those are the ones that jump out at me. But what about you?
Well, I think overall, I agree with you. In particular, I've always said How Many Herring in a Wheelbarrow, because as we went into this, that was the one that I still remembered vividly from my childhood. And then in reviewing it, I felt this is the one where they finally got a feel for the 66 show, because we got an actual death trap in the middle, a cliffhanger, unlike just some sort of questions posed and let's go to commercial. They were in danger. Everything there paced and tracked with a 66 show, so I really appreciated that one. There was one other one out of the ones you mentioned, well, not out of the ones you mentioned, that I also liked, despite also its ridiculous premise in some ways. Will the Real Robin Please Stand Up?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good one also, where we have the kid who looks just like Dick Grayson. He's got blonde hair. Right. And he's taken in by Catwoman as to be her Robin.
And she never makes the connection Dick Grayson. Instead, it's like, you look like Robin, not like you look like Dick Grayson.
So much is made over the sliding timeline of comic book companies, the sliding timeline of Marvel, the sliding timeline of DC, so that things that happened in the 60s or 70s happened just a few months ago. The way they have to do that, because, when you've got anywhere between 50, 60, 80 years of continuity or stories to kind of introduce and interject into stories, you have a sliding intelligence scale. For a lot of these cartoons, whether you're talking about Batman and Robin or Bruce and Dick or the villains, that they're only as smart as the plot wants them to be. Right. They sometimes everything is really they're really intelligent. Other times they're written to be. It's so simplistic that that they're smarter than this. That they should be able to figure it out. But the plot requires them not to. So they're actually stupider than they should be. Right. And you see that all throughout the series with all of the characters. It's just, it's a sliding scale of intelligence.
Right. Yeah. And I got to say, I did like the moments. Like, for instance, when I think he appeared in like only 2 or 3 stories altogether. But like having Chief O'Hara in there. Right. Because he was created just for the 66 series. He wasn't in prior to that point. I seem to recall he does make appearances in the comic book after, or no?
I haven't reached, I've been reading, and I think they make references to Chief, but they don't really use the character in the comics. Okay. It's really Gordon. And it's they don't really use O'Hara. I'm just thinking about what I've just been reading right now, which is, like I said, like summer 1967. And O'Hara doesn't seem to really factor into things. He might have popped up, but it might be the kind of thing where Gordon would just turn to Chief, and wouldn't necessarily be Chief O'Hara. But Chief O'Hara really was not a factor in the comics at this time. I mean, they had Aunt Harriet, but it's a completely different looking Aunt Harriet, as we've discussed in other contexts. And of course, she's not even in the cartoon here. But the basics of what really, in addition to some of the tone, it's the choice of the characters that they used on. They were when the producers were looking at it, they still looked at the four big villains as being the four big villains here: Joker, Penguin, Riddler, Catwoman. Those are the four big villains of the show. They're the four big villains here. They add Mr. Freeze as sort of a fifth, but then the show did too. And the reason why Mr. Freeze is kind of an interesting asterisk on the live action show is because he appeared 3 times and he was 3 different actors. So if the other 4 A-list, Mr. Freeze is kind of the top of the B-list. And it's the same thing here on these cartoons. He shows up a lot here, but you don't really see him teaming up with the other villains. He kind of does his own thing. When you see the team-ups, they tend to be team-ups within the framework of the 4 villains. And then you've got the whole other group of villains that they bring in that are created for the cartoon, which again also mimics what was going on at the 66 show, where they actually created villains that were gimmicky, kitschy villains that they created for the TV show, the live-action show, and that they created for Filmation here. The one difference for all of them is the fact that they did the Scarecrow on the Filmation, which they never did in the 66 live-action show. But it's a different Scarecrow from what we were accustomed to. As we talked about when we did that episode, the one time we see the Scarecrow here, his shtick is sort of like farm work, as opposed to being fear.
Right, exactly, yeah. Now, is there anything else you wanted to touch base on here when it came to this show?
Yeah, just the voice work. Olan Soule as Batman is still other than Kevin Conroy, to me, is the preeminent Batman voice, because whether you're talking about Filmation or the lion's share of the run of Super Friends, if I'm reading a comic book from the 60s, chances are the voice that is in my head is going to be Olan Soule's Batman, not Adam West's Batman.
Right.
And the same goes for Robin, where even more so for Robin, Casey Kasem was well into his 30s by the time he did this show, but his ability to capture that kind of teenage Dick Grayson, Burt Ward-esque enthusiasm and exasperation when he's frustrated, he sounds like a kid. It's such a great job, and the two of them have chemistry. I have no idea whether they did the voice work in the same room or whether they came in separately and did their voice work that way, but they really worked together. And Jane Webb made for a wonderful Batgirl. She just the 3 of them, they were pitch perfect casting for all 3 of them. And then, of course, you had Ted Knight was doing all the villains. And then you're kind of judging him on a scale of, well, which one did he do the best or which one was most memorable? I like his Joker a lot, and I like his Penguin, but I think his Riddler is the one that kind of resonates with me. And as I've said before, when I used to play with my Migos as a kid and I had the Riddler's voice, it wasn't the Gorshin voice. I didn't even realize it until years later that I was using the Ted Knight voice in my head. that halting Joker, we need to get Batman. That weird way that he would talk, which isn't really, like I said, sounds like he's going for Gorshin, but he's not really doing Gorshin. So it becomes its own thing. I really, really enjoyed that. I never really liked the way they did Mr. Freeze because they made him more thug-like than gave him a sense of style.
Right.
You know what I feel about Catwoman. I've mentioned many times over that Jane Webb did a wonderful Batgirl. I don't like the Catwoman voice. The Catwoman episodes are great. She's a great character. She's really well portrayed, but her voice is just horrible. And then the rest of them, you have Simon the Pie Man, which is sounds like Edward G. Robinson, and the Judge, I don't remember what he sounds like, or Dollman I remember sounding really creepy.
Yes.
We also didn't mention the Mad Hatter. They did the Mad Hatter too for an episode.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about him, and that was a pretty good one too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, just to also clarify, Gordon and Alfred were also Ted Knight?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing that and of course he was the narrator too.
Yes.
But with Commissioner Gordon, I don't think his hair was like a more of a darker brown than quite the same bright red hair that Barbara had. Because
right.
It was definitely more than, in the comics he was white haired, and on the TV show he was silver haired. I think they made him dark haired because they just didn't want to have any kind of confusion that they were not drawing Neil Hamilton. So they made sure that they kept the glasses on. But in the comics, he still had the mustache. He had the mustache and the white hair, and he still had that kind of classic comic book Gordon look. So, but Alfred is like right out of Carmen Infantino's version of Alfred. I mean, he looks exactly like Alfred looked in the comic at the time.
Right. Yeah,
and Ted Knight did his voice too, doing the British accent.
Yeah. And I liked his Alfred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his Alfred's great. Yeah, I like the Alfred on this series in general.
Yeah. It's amazing when you think about it, just how much they were able to produce in the sense. I mean, I know because now looking at it, we're like, well, only 17 episodes. But when you think about turning it around quickly, having a limited voice cast, limited animation skills, and yet putting out such I would say, a high quality product. I would hold this cartoon up and say to kids today, it's Batman the Animated Series and everything, and it's a wonderful show. I'm not ever going to knock it or say anything or try and because you could say apples and oranges, and yes, but I'd say if you really enjoy Batman the Animated Series, you should take a look at Filmation's 68 series. I don't know if I'm going to ever say the same with 77, but definitely with 68.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it's just a different flavor. And again, as has been written about Batman specifically over the years, is that the wonderful thing about Batman in general is how Batman endures different interpretations. Mm-hmm. You have the dark and gritty, Batman, and you also have the light and fizzy Batman 66, and you have something like Filmation, which clearly is in the ballpark of Batman 66 as opposed to what the grim and gritty Batman. But it does stretch a little bit beyond that, which is, so you do get to see kind of different angles of Batman. But yeah, it's wonderful to see an upbeat, fun, adventuring Batman. This was the Batman of our childhoods. And this is the Batman that would not just, like I said, it influenced me as a fan. It influenced the way I would play as a kid, whether I was playing with my Amigos or playing in the backyard, or playing with my ideal, vinyl play set, which was wonderful. It really felt like it was connected to the comic books that I was reading at the time, and I love it for that, and love it on its own terms. It was really been a wonderful experience to do all of these things. And you mentioned 17 episodes, but don't forget it wasn't really 17. What it was amazing is that it was really 34.
Right.
34 cartoons. 17 two-parters, 17 one-parters. That's a lot of material.
Yeah. And say, unlike, because you and I are doing the Super Friends series right now, reviewing them on the World's Greatest Super Friends podcast, unlike that show where we're seeing with the first season, there were 3 different animation units handling the animation. So the artwork was often inconsistent, at least even for its flaws. The animation is consistent throughout this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. And what was nice is that you would still get to see also flourishes where you're just kind of you're taken aback. You're like, oh, that looked really good.
Yeah.
Which would remind you about how much how much these cartoons had going for them. And you just make you think that what would they have been able to accomplish if they had more time and more money to do these.
Right.
As opposed to having to rush them. Because they definitely, there's a lot of really good, exciting work in here.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Batcave podcast. But before we go, Dan, we've been talking about 13thdimension.com and all the great Batman Filmation content. But what else is going on over at your great website?
Well, thank you. It's as always, we focus on comics and comics related material yesterday and today. A lot of retro stuff. You're always going to find stuff like what's, something that's new, something that looks back at something, with years worth of perspective. We have a lot of guest columnists who come in, whether they're creators or other people like you and me who just really love this stuff. But if I'm looking at the website now, for example, we've got, a couple of exclusive announcements from Marvel Comics about some great stuff that fans of old comics are going to love. Listings of right now, comics writer Ron Mars put together the top 13 comic stories of the gods, old and new. A look back at the 1970s Spidey rock comic. We like to mix things up, and also we do a lot of themes. I got a lot of Spider-Man material right now because the Spider-Man movie is out right now. So if you like all that kind of stuff, and you like the kind of stuff that we talk about here on the podcast, chances are you'll dig what we have over at the site. So come pay us a visit.
And that's 13th Dimension, 13thdimension.com.
That it is.
So, folks, stay tuned. Dan will be back because we're also going to start picking up on our comic book reviews from the Batman 66 comic book series that DC had running there for a few years. We're going to start with issue number 9. I'm saying episode because some of these really, especially the one we're going to be doing next, really comes across like it could have been an episode of the TV series.
Yeah, we have a long way to go on that one. So I'm really looking forward to picking that up again because there was a lot of great stuff in that series.
Absolutely, yep. And in addition, we'll continue our look at Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. We'll begin our look with Monster Squad and with the 77 Filmation series. And Robert Long will be along as we continue our look at those fan-made movies and cartoons that were done in homage to Batman 66. That's all happening here on the Batcave podcast. Stay tuned for all that, folks, and thank you once again for listening. So until next time, Dan, citizens, take care.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening, chums. I don't have a bat phone, but you can contact the Batcave podcast through its Facebook page, Twitter, email at thebatcavepodcast@gmail.com, subscribe to the podcast via Libsyn.com, that's LIBSYN.com, or through iTunes. The Batcave podcast is part of a series of pop culture podcasts from the Chronic Rift Network. Find them at chronicrift.com. So until next time, citizens, same bat time, same Batcave podcast.